My name is Katrina, and I'm 34 years old. That Easter Sunday, I wore a hat that changed everything. Easter has always been a big deal in our town. We might be small, tucked in the heart of Missouri farmland, but when it comes to church holidays, we go all out: lavish brunches, pastel dresses, ribbons on every mailbox, and enough gossip to fill the pews before the sermon even begins. I grew up here, knowing every face and every whispered story that traveled faster than the church bells. Some people find comfort in that small-town closeness. I never did. When my parents were alive, we were respected. Our family owned a large piece of land just beyond Willow Creek, a property my grandfather built from nothing. But when I was a teenager, everything changed. A legal mix-up, a missing signature, and a ruthless mayor's deal stripped my family of what was rightfully ours. We were humiliated. My parents never recovered from that loss, and for years I carried that quiet shame everywhere I went. I left town for a while after college, swearing I'd never come back. But something about unfinished business has a way of pulling you home. When I returned 2 years ago, I came back with purpose. I wasn't the same timid girl people remembered. I was determined to reclaim what we'd lost, even if that meant walking right into the lion's den wearing my grandmother's old Easter hat. The plan had taken months of research and patience. After digging through my father's old boxes, I found papers that hinted the land had never been legally transferred in the first place. It took legal filings, quiet visits to the county records office, and more than a few sleepless nights, but I finally got what I needed: the restored deed, signed and sealed. My name was on it, mine, not the mayor's, not his wife Barbara's, not the town's. Ours again. I could have announced it quietly, sent a letter, held a press conference. But that wasn't the point. For years, those same people laughed at my parents, mocked our downfall, and called us fools. They whispered that my father drank away his land, that my mother exaggerated our loss. No one believed the truth. So, I decided if I was going to reveal it, I'd do it in front of every single one of them. The morning of Easter Sunday, I stood before my mirror and pinned my hair up neatly beneath that lavender satin hat. It had belonged to my grandmother, passed down through generations of women who worked hard and never forgot where they came from. I lined the brim with a bit of lace and tucked the parchment, the deed, inside the crown, securing it with a small pin. I made sure it wouldn't slip. It felt symbolic, like wearing history on my head. When I stepped out of my house, the sun was just beginning to warm the spring air. The tulips along Main Street swayed as I walked past the bakery, the scent of fresh bread and cinnamon mixing with lilac perfume. People smiled and waved, pretending to be friendly, but I could already feel their eyes darting to my hat. It was bold, maybe even old-fashioned, but I didn't care. I walked with purpose, every step a silent declaration that I was no longer ashamed of who I was or where I came from. The church loomed ahead, its white steeple glinting in the morning light. Children in pastel suits and dresses darted around, clutching baskets and laughing. Parents exchanged polite greetings, and the choir's soft harmonies floated through the open doors. I paused on the steps, took a breath, and walked inside. The moment I entered, the room quieted just slightly, but enough to notice. Heads turned. I could feel it, the weight of judgment, curiosity, and amusement mixing together. Barbara, the mayor's wife, sat in the front pew surrounded by her circle of admirers. Her lips curled in a smirk when she saw me. She whispered something to the woman beside her, and a ripple of laughter followed. I didn't need to guess what it was about. Still, I kept walking. I didn't rush or shrink back. I made my way to the second row, holding my chin high. The pastor gave me a small nod as I sat down. My hands were trembling slightly in my lap, but I pressed them together until the shaking stopped. I told myself over and over, today is the day, just wait. The service began with hymns and prayers, and though I mouthed the words, my mind was elsewhere. I thought about my parents, their quiet endurance, their faith that someday justice would find its way back to us. I could almost hear my mother's voice whispering, "Be patient, Kat. The truth always comes around." When the sermon ended, people began to shuffle out toward the lawn for the Easter photos and brunch. I stayed seated for a moment longer, waiting for the crowd to thin. The sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting soft colors across my lap. I reached up, touched the edge of my hat, and smiled to myself. When I stepped into the church wearing that wide-brimmed hat, every pair of eyes turned toward me. They whispered and chuckled, calling my hat ridiculous, but I kept walking. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was sharp, quick, cutting, and intentional. I could tell by the way Barbara covered her mouth with her gloved hand, pretending to whisper something funny to her friend, that she wanted me to hear it. Her little circle of socialites leaned in closer, each taking turns smirking in my direction like a flock of brightly dressed crows. I'd seen this kind of scene 100 times before. Only this time, I wasn't the same girl they once mocked. The church lawn was alive with the sound of chatter and camera shutters. Every Easter Sunday followed the same rhythm. Service, photos, then brunch in the fellowship hall. Barbara, with her perfect hair and her designer pearls, loved to play queen of the crowd. To everyone else, she represented grace and tradition. To me, she was the face of everything my family had lost. As I walked toward the refreshment tables, I caught snippets of their whispers. "Can you believe she wore that thing?" one woman murmured. "Looks like something straight from 1950. Another laughed. "Maybe she found it in her attic." I smiled politely when our eyes met, as if their words didn't reach me. But they did. Each one stung like a bee sting under the skin. Still, I kept my steps steady. Each one rehearsed. Deliberate. The air smelled of coffee, sugar, and blooming magnolias. Children ran around our legs, their laughter pure and innocent, untainted by the judgment swirling above them. I looked at them and thought how easy it was to lose that innocence in this town, how quickly kindness turned to cruelty when people sensed weakness. Daisy appeared beside me, holding 2 cups of lemonade. Her voice, soft and warm, was a balm in that moment. "Ignore them," she said quietly. "They don't know what's coming." I couldn't help but grin. Daisy had been my best friend since grade school. She'd seen my family's downfall firsthand, and never once joined the chorus of gossip. She was the only person who knew what I carried that day, the secret folded inside my hat. "I don't mind the whispers," I said. "They'll quiet soon enough." She looked at me, her eyes curious but proud. "You're sure you're ready for this?" "I've been ready for 20 years. As we stood near the flower arch where people were taking photos, I noticed the mayor making his way through the crowd. He shook hands, smiled for pictures, the perfect image of a small-town leader. But when his gaze landed on me, his expression tightened just slightly. Enough to reveal that he hadn't forgotten who I was, or what his family had taken from mine. Barbara noticed the look too. She glanced between us, then back at me, and smirked again. "Katrina, darling," she called out, her voice lilting and fake. "That's quite the hat you've chosen. It's unique." I turned toward her slowly, keeping my composure. "Thank you," I said. "It's an heirloom." "Oh, I see," she said, a glimmer of mischief in her eyes. "From your grandmother, perhaps." I didn't realize vintage was making such a strong comeback. Her friends laughed, delighted by her jab. Daisy shifted uncomfortably beside me, but I raised a hand, signaling her to stay calm. "Some things never go out of style," I replied. Barbara tilted her head. "Well, maybe next year, you'll try something a little more contemporary." Her tone was sugary sweet, but the venom underneath was unmistakable. She thrived on these moments, small public humiliations where she could assert her status while pretending innocence. I glanced at the crowd gathering closer, watching the exchange. It was just like them to flock to drama disguised as polite conversation. The whole town loved a good story, especially when I was the subject. "Well," I said with a calmness that even surprised me. "Next year might look very different for all of us." Barbara laughed lightly, confused but amused. "Oh, planning something big?" "Something like that," I said, my fingers brushing the edge of my hat. The sunlight was strong now, making the lavender fabric shimmer faintly. I could feel the warmth through the brim, and I thought of the parchment inside the deed, folded and safe, waiting for its moment. I felt the weight of it like a heartbeat against my scalp. Daisy caught my eye and gave a subtle nod. She knew I was waiting for the right moment, one that would leave no doubt, no rumor, no denial possible. Timing mattered. As the choir began to sing again for the outdoor service, I stood among them, pretending to listen while the mayor took his seat near the front. His smile was tight now. His fingers fidgeted. He knew something was coming. I could see it in the way he avoided looking directly at me. When the song ended, Barbara rose from her seat and approached me again. Clearly not finished. "Katrina," she said. Her voice honeyed. "You know, you really are brave wearing that. Not many people could pull off something so eccentric." I smiled softly. "You're right, Barbara. Not many could." A few people chuckled awkwardly, sensing the tension but unsure which side to favor. I didn't let the silence linger. Instead, I reached up and adjusted my hat slightly, as if to make sure it was sitting right. The edge brushed against my cheek, and I caught Barbara's reflection in the glass door of the church, her smirk frozen mid-expression. I turned just enough to meet her eyes. "You know," I said gently, "this hat means more to me than anyone here could guess." Her brows lifted in mock interest. "Oh, is there a story behind it?" "Maybe I'll share it soon," I replied. Then I smiled, turned away, and walked toward the tables, the hem of my dress swaying lightly with each step. I could feel their eyes on me, some amused, some curious, some waiting for me to stumble. But I didn't. I had waited too long for this moment to falter now. As I turned slightly, I caught Barbara's sneer and smiled to myself, knowing her laughter wouldn't last long. After the service, everyone gathered outside for the Easter photos and social hour. The churchyard was a burst of color pastel dresses, crisp suits, and laughter echoing beneath the clear blue sky. It was the same every year, predictable and polished. Parents herded their children toward the flower arch for photos, while older couples lingered near the tables covered in lace tablecloths and trays of lemon bars. The town photographer shouted directions over the noise, telling people where to stand and smile. I stood near the edge of it all, sipping a cup of sweet tea that Daisy had handed me. From a distance, everything looked so perfect, like something out of a spring postcard. But, beneath the laughter, I could feel the tension, those sideways glances, the whispers that carried my name. It was almost amusing now. They had no idea that in just a few moments, everything they thought they knew about me would change. Barbara was in her element. She floated through the crowd like she owned the place, her coral dress hugging her frame, her pearl necklace gleaming in the sun. Her husband, Mayor Harold Benton, followed a few steps behind, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, and pretending to be the benevolent man of the people. I'd seen that act for decades. I'd also seen the documents proving how he'd signed my grandfather's land away in a deal that made him rich and left my family destitute. As Barbara's laughter rang across the lawn, I felt that familiar sting of anger deep in my chest. Not the kind that burns fast and fades, but the slow, steady kind, the kind that builds and waits for the right moment to strike. Daisy nudged me gently. "You sure you want to do this now?" "Yes," I said, my voice calm. "It's time." The choir started singing again, softer this time, a light hymn to accompany the social hour. The notes drifted through the air, almost drowning out the chatter. I set down my cup and straightened my shoulders. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I refused to let it show. Barbara spotted me across the lawn and began to saunter over, her friends trailing behind her like a pack of pastel shadows. I could tell by her expression that she wasn't finished with her little performance. "Well, if it isn't our town's newest fashion icon," she said brightly, her smile as sharp as glass. "You really do know how to make an entrance, Katrina." I turned toward her, keeping my expression calm. "You could say that." She laughed, pretending to be charmed. "It's a lovely hat, very bold." I gave her a patient smile. "Thank you, it means a lot to me." Her friends giggled again, whispering behind. "Gloved hands?" One of them, Nancy, I think, leaned forward. "Where did you find something like that?" "My grandmother used to have one just like it for church picnics." "Oh, this?" I said softly, running my fingers along the brim. "It's been in my family for generations. Barbara tilted her head. Ah, a family heirloom. How sweet. She paused just long enough for her voice to drop into something colder. Your family didn't have much left to hand down, did they? The words hit like a slap. But I refused to flinch. Daisy inhaled sharply beside me, ready to step in, but I raised a hand slightly to stop her. You're right, I said evenly. We lost a lot. But some things have a way of finding their way back. Barbara blinked, confused by my tone. Oh? What do you mean by that? I smiled faintly. You'll see. The crowd began to circle closer. People sensed something was happening, something out of the ordinary. Even the mayor stopped his conversation and turned to watch us. The choir's last note faded, leaving a strange silence in its wake. I could feel the weight of that silence pressing on my skin. My pulse quickened, but my hands stayed steady. I reached up, touched the brim of my hat, and felt the faint ridge of the folded parchment tucked inside. The deed was right there, tangible proof of my family's restoration. I'd dreamed of this moment for years. Katrina, the pastor said, stepping closer, sensing the growing attention. Is everything all right? Perfectly, I replied. Actually, I think it's time I shared something with everyone, Barbara laughed lightly. Oh, please, don't tell me it's a sermon about vintage fashion. I ignored her, lifting the hat slowly from my head. A hush fell over the crowd. The lavender satin shimmered in the sunlight as I turned it in my hands, fingers tracing the inner seam. Then, carefully, I pulled out the folded parchment. The paper was aged but crisp, bound with a golden seal from the county registrar's office. A few gasps rippled through the crowd as the sunlight hit the wax emblem. Barbara's laughter faltered. The mayor's face drained of color. I held it up, letting everyone see it clearly. This, I said, my voice steady, belongs to my family. A murmur passed through the onlookers. The pastor looked from me to the mayor, confusion flickering in his eyes. Barbara frowned. What are you talking about? I unfolded the top edge, revealing the words written in elegant cursive. Property deed Willow Hill Estate. People shifted uneasily. Everyone in town knew that name. Willow Hill Estate wasn't just any property, it was one of the largest plots in the county. The mayor and his wife had lived there for years, claiming it as their own. Barbara stared at the paper, her lips parting in disbelief. That can't be real. Oh, it's real, I said quietly. And it's mine. The crowd collectively inhaled, their whispers breaking the silence like distant thunder. The mayor took a step forward, his hand half raised, his voice tight. Katrina, I think you're mistaken. That property was never yours, I interrupted. It was taken from my family under false pretenses decades ago. I spent the last year proving it. The county recognized the mistake. This, I lifted the deed slightly higher, is the correction. All around me, the Easter celebration had turned into something else entirely. The laughter was gone. The air was thick with disbelief, fear, and curiosity. Barbara stood frozen, her face pale, her perfectly composed mask beginning to crack. Daisy moved closer, her hand brushing mine in silent support. The mayor's jaw clenched as his eyes darted to the seal, to the signature, to the gathered townsfolk who were now whispering his name. I watched the panic bloom behind his polished smile, and I knew it was only beginning. The moment I reached up to adjust the hat, I knew the next few minutes would change my life forever. Barbara asked if I'd borrowed the hat from my grandmother's attic. Her voice sliced through the tense silence, forced and shaky, as if she could somehow laugh her way out of what was unfolding. That's quite the show, Katrina, she said, trying to sound amused. Tell me, did you borrow that hat from your grandmother's attic along with the paperwork? A few people tittered nervously, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. I could see her trying to take back control, but it was slipping from her, piece by piece. The mayor stood beside her now, rigid, his hand twitching near his pocket. His jaw was tight, and his smile, his political smile, had vanished entirely. I turned slowly to face her. No, I said, keeping my tone even. I didn't borrow it. It's an heirloom. Much like the land your husband has been living on. That silenced even the nervous laughter. The tension in the air thickened. The crowd, once lively and buzzing with post-service chatter, now felt like a court audience waiting for a verdict. Even the children had gone quiet. Barbara blinked, her lips parting just slightly. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice brittle. "What did you just say?" I lifted the parchment so everyone could see it again. "You heard me," I said. "This is the deed to Willow Hill Estate, my grandfather's property, the one your husband's name was never legally attached to." There was a collective murmur. I could hear someone whisper, "Is that true?" Another person muttered, "That can't be right." But curiosity was stronger than disbelief. Barbara let out a weak laugh, gesturing toward her husband. "Harold, tell everyone that's nonsense." The mayor swallowed hard, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came. He looked at the seal again, then at the crowd, then finally at me. I don't know what she's trying to pull," he said, his voice rough, defensive. "That document could be anything." I stepped forward, meeting his gaze without blinking. "It's a certified copy from the county clerk's office. You can check the signature yourself. It's dated March 3rd, 2 weeks ago." The pastor hesitated, then reached out. "May I see it, Katrina?" I handed it to him carefully, watching as he unfolded it completely. His eyes moved over the elegant handwriting, the seals, the signatures, and the embossed county emblem. When he looked up, there was disbelief but also certainty. "This looks official," he said slowly. The crowd rustled. Some people leaned closer, others craned their necks to see. Barbara took a step back, her face tightening. "This is absurd," she said sharply. "Even if that were real, which I highly doubt, you can't just wave a piece of paper around and claim property like it's a raffle prize." "Funny," I said softly. "That's almost exactly how your husband took it from my grandfather." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The mayor's face flushed a deep red. "Now hold on a second," he barked. "You're accusing me of something that happened before you were even born. You have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I do," I replied. "I've spent the last year combing through archives, letters, and court records. And I found the missing transaction documents, the ones your father conveniently misplaced when he took over the county office all those years ago." His eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but it was enough. The truth had landed. Barbara's voice faltered. "You're lying. This is slander. It's evidence," I said, and gestured toward the pastor, who still held the paper gingerly in his hands. "Ask him." The pastor cleared his throat awkwardly. "It does appear to be legitimate, Barbara. The seal's genuine." Barbara's mouth opened and closed like she was, trying to form words but couldn't. The crowd was whispering now, too loud to ignore, too unified to control. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "When I came back here 2 years ago, I didn't do it to stir up old wounds. I just wanted to restore what rightfully belonged to my family. I didn't think it would lead to all this." I looked around, meeting the eyes of the people I'd grown up with, some skeptical, most stunned. "But I guess some things have to come to light eventually." Barbara tried to laugh again, but it came out brittle and hollow. "You think this will make people respect you? Waving around some old paper? That land has been in our name for decades. Everyone knows that. They know what you told them," I said, my voice low. "They don't know the truth." I stepped closer until we were only a few feet apart. The sunlight hit the parchment in the pastor's hands, reflecting gold. The air was utterly still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Barbara's friends exchanged uneasy glances. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. I could almost hear his thoughts scrambling for an escape route, and then, it happened. A sudden gust of wind swept across the churchyard. The paper fluttered in the pastor's hands, and the top edge flipped open fully. The embossed letters shimmered clearly for everyone to see. "Property deed. Transfer of ownership, Katrina Mayfield." The crowd gasped audibly. Someone dropped a plate. Children stared wide-eyed. Barbara's laugh died in her throat. Her hand went to her chest. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be right." The mayor's face was pale as he reached for the document, but the pastor stepped back protectively. All around us, the whispers grew louder, questions rising like a storm. I didn't move. I simply stood there, the hat still in my hands, the spring breeze tugging at my dress, and for the first time in decades, I felt taller than every person around me. The same people who had laughed at me minutes before now stared in stunned silence, watching the truth unfold right before their eyes. Barbara's lips trembled, but no words came. The mayor's jaw locked, and in that silence, I smiled not out of spite, but out of long-awaited relief. When the wind unfurled the paper slightly, the words property deed glimmered and the laughter stopped. Silence swept through the crowd like a sudden storm. The laughter that had filled the churchyard only moments ago vanished, replaced by a thick, uneasy stillness. Even the birds seemed to quiet, their chirping fading as if nature itself paused to listen. I could feel the shift one heartbeat to the next, and in that instant, I knew the balance of this town had changed. The mayor's hand hovered near the parchment, trembling slightly. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice cracking. "You can't just show up on Easter Sunday and what?" I interrupted calmly. "Tell the truth?" Every eye turned toward me. My words felt sharper than I intended. But I didn't regret them. For years, this man had smiled in my parents' faces, shaken their hands, and then turned around and called them foolish behind closed doors. He'd built his reputation on something that wasn't his, and deep down, I think he knew it all along. I stepped closer to him, my heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. "You've known this was coming, haven't you?" I said quietly, so only he could hear. "That's why you've been avoiding me for months." His face tightened. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I do," I whispered. "I've seen the letters your father wrote to mine, the ones that said the sale was temporary. You just hoped everyone would forget." He swallowed hard but said nothing. Around us, the townsfolk whispered, their voices rising and falling like waves. The pastor held the document delicately, reading and rereading the header as if trying to make sense of it himself. "Katrina," he said finally, his voice careful, "this seems very official. The seal is valid and it's signed by the county registrar." I nodded. "It is." Barbara stepped forward, her tone snapping like brittle glass. "There must be some mistake. We've paid taxes on that land for years, surely that means something." "It means you've been paying taxes on property that was never legally transferred," I said simply. "You've been living there under false ownership." Murmurs spread again, shocked, confused, some sympathetic, others stunned. An older woman, Mrs. Langley, who'd known my parents, spoke up. "So you're saying your family owns Willow Hill again? The whole estate?" I met her eyes and nodded. "Yes, as of 2 weeks ago the property was reinstated under my name." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. For a town where news usually spread in whispers, this was lightning. I could almost feel the words being carried through the air, darting from ear to ear. "Katrina owns Willow Hill again." Barbara's face was turning red, blotchy in a way no amount of makeup could hide. "You can't just take everything we've built," she spat. "That land is our home." I looked at her evenly. "Funny. That's exactly what my mother said 30 years ago." For a moment, no one breathed. The air was thick with memory, history, and the undeniable weight of justice long overdue. I didn't want to gloat, I wanted them to understand. My voice softened. "You took our home. You took our dignity. All I'm doing is setting things right." Barbara's lips quivered as she turned toward her husband. "Harold, say something." The mayor stared down at the grass, his shoulders rigid, his silence louder than anything he could have said. The pastor cleared his throat gently. "Well," he said, "this is certainly unexpected news, but if the documents are legitimate, then the matter seems settled." That single word "settled" seemed to echo through the crowd like a final gavel strike. People began to murmur again, this time less about disbelief and more about acceptance. I caught snippets of conversation. "She really did it. I thought that land was gone forever. Good for her family." I felt a lump rise in my throat. For so long, I'd dreamed of this moment not for revenge, but for vindication. To see people realize that my parents hadn't lied, that their name still meant something, was a kind of peace I didn't think I'd ever feel again. Barbara turned back toward me, her voice shaking with anger. "You think this makes you better than us?" "No," I said softly. "It just makes things right." I could see tears gathering in her eyes, not from sorrow but from humiliation. Her perfect world, her carefully curated reputation, was cracking in front of everyone. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. The mayor finally spoke again, though his words were low and bitter. "You've made a fool of yourself, Katrina, parading around with this stunt. You'll regret it." I smiled faintly. "Maybe. But at least I won't regret staying silent anymore." The pastor handed the parchment back to me, his expression unreadable but respectful. "You've caused quite a stir today, Miss Mayfield," he said. "But perhaps it was long overdue." "Perhaps," I replied. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it back into the lining of my hat. The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmuring among themselves. Some avoided my eyes, others smiled faintly. A few even came up to me to shake my hand or offer quiet congratulations. One older man patted my shoulder as he passed. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. I blinked back tears, nodding. "Thank you." As people began leaving for brunch, Barbara and her husband stood alone near the flower arch. Their faces were drawn and tight, like a photograph beginning to fade. I almost pitied them almost. The pastor placed a hand on my arm. "Are you sure you'll be all right?" he asked softly. "I'll be fine," I said, though my heart was pounding. "It's over now." But even as I said the words, a chill passed through me. The mayor was still watching me, his expression no longer angry, but calculating. It wasn't the look of a man defeated. It was the look of someone already planning his next move. I held his gaze for a moment, then turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the cobblestones, the folded deed warm against my skin. The spring wind tugged at the edge of my hat, and somewhere behind me, I could still hear the faint hum of whispers, and when I said the words, "It's mine again," the air seemed to freeze. Barbara's face twisted with disbelief. She looked at me as if the ground beneath her had betrayed her, as if the entire world had suddenly tilted off balance. Her carefully rehearsed expressions, charm, control, superiority, all cracked at once. I could almost see the fear creeping behind her eyes, though she tried to hide it with anger. "You can't just come in here and embarrass us like this," she snapped, her voice trembling. "You've humiliated our family." I met her gaze evenly. "No, Barbara. I've told the truth. If the truth embarrasses you, maybe you should ask yourself why." The crowd was still gathered, torn between fascination and discomfort. A few people were whispering to one another, exchanging looks that said finally, someone stood up to them. The mayor, however, was growing restless. He ran a hand through his thinning gray hair and took a deep breath, his voice dropping into a low growl. "That document doesn't mean anything unless it's recognized by the courts. You think you can wave a piece of paper around and claim ownership? It's not that simple." "Oh, I know," I said quietly. "That's why I didn't just bring one document." I reached into my purse and pulled out a second envelope thicker, sealed with an official stamp. Gasps echoed through the crowd again. The mayor's eyes followed the movement, suspicion flashing across his face. I handed the envelope to the pastor. "These," I said, "are letters from the county clerk's office and from my attorney. They confirm that the land transfer was processed, verified, and filed with the registrar. As of March 3rd, Willow Hill legally belongs to me." The pastor opened the envelope carefully. Inside were 2 notarized letters and a stamped copy of the court order. He scanned them quickly, then looked up with wide eyes. "She's telling the truth," he said softly. "Everything is valid. It's official." A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. I saw it spread like a wave, first disbelief, then murmurs, and finally a slow understanding that this wasn't some public stunt. This was real. Barbara stumbled back a step. "That's impossible. Harold, do something." The mayor didn't move. His lips pressed into a thin line. his jaw tightening as he stared at the letters. "Who helped you?" he asked quietly. "Who told you where to find those records?" I tilted my head slightly. "You mean the records your father hid? The ones marked missing in 1994? His face went white. "I found them in my father's old trunk," I continued, my voice low but strong. "He kept copies of every transaction, every letter, every threat your family sent him. He never gave up trying to prove what you'd done." I felt my throat tighten, emotion pressing against my chest, but I didn't let it break me. He died believing the truth would never come out. But it did. The crowd was silent, no one daring to speak. For the first time in years, the mayor's confident facade was gone. He looked smaller somehow, just a man who'd finally been cornered by the truth. "I don't know what kind of story you've convinced yourself of," he said, trying to recover. "But you're playing with fire. This isn't a game." I took a small step closer, my voice calm but firm. "No, it's not. It's justice, and it's long overdue." Barbara's friends began to edge away, avoiding her eyes. One of them, Nancy, muttered something about needing to check on her kids and slipped off. The others followed, leaving Barbara standing alone beside her husband, trembling. Daisy appeared at my side, her hand brushing mine lightly for reassurance. "You did it," she whispered. "It's really over, but I wasn't sure it was." The look on the mayor's face told me this wouldn't end quietly. He wasn't the type to accept defeat. He stepped forward suddenly, his anger breaking through the mask. "You listen to me, Katrina," he said, pointing a finger toward me. "You might have a few pieces of paper and some old story, but you don't know what you're getting yourself into. That land is more than dirt, it's history, reputation, legacy. You think you can just take that from us?" My voice didn't waver. "You already took it from me once. I'm just taking it back." The crowd murmured again. Louder this time. Voices rising in agreement. "She's right," someone said from the back. "If it's legally hers, she's got every right." For a second, I thought the mayor might explode. His face was bright red, and his hands clenched into fists. Barbara reached out, tugging his sleeve. "Harold, stop!" she hissed. "Not here." But he ignored her. "You'll regret this." He spat, his voice shaking. "You have no idea what you've started." I met his glare, holding it until he finally turned away. "Maybe," I said softly. "But at least it's the truth." He stormed off toward the parking lot, his footsteps crunching against the gravel. Barbara hesitated, torn between following him and saving face in front of everyone. Finally, she turned sharply and hurried after him, her heels sinking into the grass. The crowd slowly began to disperse again, buzzing with low voices. I could feel the shift sympathy now, not mockery. People who once ignored me now nodded as they passed, their faces softening with a mix of curiosity and respect. The pastor handed me back the documents. That took courage. Not many would have done it this way. I smiled faintly. Sometimes the truth needs to be seen to be believed. He nodded and walked away, still shaking his head in disbelief. Daisy turned to me, her expression glowing with pride. "You handled that perfectly. You didn't even raise your voice." "I didn't need to," I said. The truth spoke loud enough. The afternoon sun had started to sink lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. Families were packing up their picnic baskets. Children laughing again now that the tension had lifted. It looked almost peaceful, as if nothing monumental had just happened. But I knew better. Beneath that calm, something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. Daisy squeezed my hand gently. "It's really over, isn't it?" I looked toward the parking lot where the mayor's car had disappeared down the road, my reflection flickering in the glass doors of the church. "Not yet," I said quietly. "He's not the kind of man who loses gracefully." The wind picked up, brushing against my hat as I placed it back on my head, the deed safely hidden once more. I took one last look at the churchyard, the place where my family's humiliation had started, and walked away with steady steps. But I also saw the fury rising in the mayor's eyes and knew this wasn't over. He stormed toward me, snatching the paper from the pastor's hand. It happened so suddenly that for a split second, I didn't react. One moment the pastor was holding the deed, still in disbelief over what had unfolded. The next, the mayor lunged forward, his face red and twisted, ripping it out of his hands. Gasps shot through the crowd as he clutched the parchment, shaking it like it might crumble if he just gripped hard enough. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" he barked, his voice booming across the churchyard. "You're a liar, Katrina. A manipulative, conniving liar." I felt my pulse quicken, but I didn't step back. I refused to give him that satisfaction. "I'm none of those things," I said, my voice steady. "Everything I've shown is real. You can check every signature, every stamp, I don't need to check anything," he shouted, cutting me off. "This is fake. You forged it." The word forged rippled through the crowd like a slap. People began whispering again, some out of shock, others out of disbelief. The pastor reached forward, trying to calm him. "Harold, please, there's no reason to cause a scene. Let's handle this civilly." But the mayor wasn't listening. He was too far gone, anger burning through his polished exterior. "You don't fool me," he growled. "You were always looking for a way to ruin me, to make me look bad. You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you?" I lifted my chin, holding his gaze. "I didn't need to ruin you, Harold. You did that yourself." For a moment, the look in his eyes shifted from rage to something colder, fear. Then, just as quickly, he masked it again with indignation. He thrust the parchment toward me. "You expect anyone to believe this garbage? That you, of all people, somehow uncovered lost records from 30 years ago? Give me a break." Daisy stepped closer, her voice trembling but firm. "She's not lying, Harold. I've seen the paperwork myself. I helped her contact the county." He turned on her like a cornered animal. "Stay out of this, Daisy. This doesn't concern you." "Yes, it does," she snapped. "You've spent years lying to everyone in this town, and now you're angry because someone finally called you out." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke, but I could see the truth dawning in their eyes. The mayor's desperation was palpable, and the more he shouted, the guiltier he looked. I took a breath, my voice calm but cutting. "I didn't forge anything, Harold. I have legal documents, county letters, and witnesses. You can yell all you want, it won't change the facts." He glared at me, breathing hard, his hands trembling as he held the parchment. I could tell he didn't know what to do next. If he tore it, it would only prove he was hiding something. If he handed it back, it would be a silent admission of defeat. Finally, he dropped it into the pastor's hands and stepped back, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll regret this, Katrina. I promise you that." Something in the way he said it made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just a threat, it was a vow. Barbara hurried to his side, her voice trembling. "Harold, let's just go." But he didn't move. His eyes were locked on mine, dark and burning. "You think you've won something," he said. "But this isn't over. You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," I said quietly. "A man who's afraid of losing everything that was never his to begin with." His nostrils flared. For a heartbeat, I thought he might strike me. But then, as if remembering where he was, he straightened his suit jacket, forced a bitter smile, and turned toward the pastor. "I'll see to it this matter is resolved properly," he said tightly. "Legally." He turned to the crowd. "All of you don't believe everything you hear. This woman is trying to destroy my family's name." But no one answered. The crowd had already made up its mind. People exchanged looks pity for me once, now directed at him. The pastor cleared his throat. "Maybe that's best discussed elsewhere," he said softly. "This is Easter Sunday, after all." The mayor's jaw clenched. He shot me one last poisonous glare before grabbing Barbara's arm and storming off toward his car. She stumbled behind him, her heels sinking in the grass, her face pale and drawn. The crowd parted as they passed, silent as a funeral procession. When the roar of the engine finally faded, the air seemed to ease again. The tension broke like a fragile string. Daisy exhaled shakily. "Well," she said, half laughing, half in awe. "I think that's the first time anyone's ever seen Harold Benton lose his temper in public." I smiled faintly. It won't be the last. The pastor handed me back the parchment. I'll hold on to a copy of this if you'd like, he offered. Just in case. Please, I said. I'd feel better knowing it's somewhere safe. He nodded solemnly. You did something remarkable today, Katrina. Not many people would have had the courage. I looked around the churchyard, the faces, the whispers, the way the light seemed different now. It wasn't courage, I said softly. It was necessity. Daisy squeezed my arm gently. Let's go home, she said. You've had enough drama for one day. We walked together toward my car, the last of the crowd slowly dispersing behind us. But even as we left, I could feel eyes still watching. Not the curious or judgmental ones from earlier, these felt heavier, more intent. When I turned my head, I caught sight of someone near the far edge of the churchyard, a man in a dark car, engine running, just sitting there. The moment he noticed me looking, the car pulled away. Daisy didn't see it, but I did, and deep down, I knew it wasn't the last time I'd see those headlights. That night, I replayed the scene in my mind over and over: the crowd, the mayor's rage, the way his voice had trembled with something deeper than anger. He wasn't just humiliated, he was afraid. And fear, I knew, could make dangerous men desperate. I placed the hat carefully on my dresser, the folded deed inside it once again. The house was quiet except for the sound of wind brushing against the window pane. I should have felt at peace. I'd done it, I'd reclaimed what was ours. But as I turned off the light and lay down, the echo of his voice wouldn't leave me. Then he looked up, eyes blazing, and shouted, "You'll regret this, Katrina!" He stormed off toward his car, leaving Barbara standing in the crowd. For a moment, the churchyard looked frozen, Barbara's pastel dress fluttering in the breeze, the pastor clutching the papers, the townsfolk staring after the mayor's retreating figure. Then, as if on cue, the whispers began again. Only this time, they weren't about my hat. I stood there quietly, letting the murmurs wash over me. My hands trembled, but I kept them clasped in front of me. Daisy leaned in close and whispered, "You handled that perfectly, Kat. Don't let him rattle you." I nodded, but my heart hadn't settled yet. Something about the way he'd said, "You'll regret this," stuck in my chest like a splinter. Harold Benton wasn't the type to make empty threats. Barbara's eyes darted around nervously, scanning the crowd that had once worshipped her. They weren't smiling now. Some looked away to avoid her gaze, others whispered behind their hands. Her perfectly painted mask began to crack. She clutched her pearl necklace and forced a shaky smile. "Everyone, please, don't listen to that nonsense," she said too loudly. "This is just a misunderstanding." No one responded. Barbara's voice wavered as she turned to the pastor. "Tell them, Pastor, tell them this is all some kind of mix-up." The pastor looked down, uncomfortable. "Barbara," he said softly, "the documents seem legitimate, there's no mistake." Her face fell, and for the first time in all the years I'd known her, I saw genuine fear flicker behind her eyes. Not for the land itself, maybe, but for what losing it meant for her image, her status, her hold over this town. I took pity on her, just for a moment. "Barbara," I said gently, "no one wants to see your family suffer. I only want what was taken from mine." She turned sharply toward me. "You've taken everything from us." "Everything?" I repeated quietly. "You mean what wasn't yours to begin with?" The bitterness in her eyes deepened. But she had no reply. She just stood there, her jaw tight, her lips pressed into a thin line, before finally turning and walking briskly toward the parking lot to join her husband. As their car disappeared down the road, I released the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The churchyard began to stir again, parents calling to their children, the pastor urging people toward the luncheon, the rhythm of normalcy slowly returning. A few townsfolk approached me, people who had never said more than 2 words to me before. Mrs. Langley took my hand with tears in her eyes. "Your father was a good man, Katrina," she said softly. "He didn't deserve what happened. You've done him proud." "Thank you," I said, my throat tight. Then came the others' neighbors who'd once whispered behind closed doors, now offering quiet apologies or nods of approval. I accepted their kind words graciously, even though part of me wanted to tell them it was too late for their sympathy. Daisy looped her arm through mine. "Come on," she said with a small smile. "You deserve a coffee. Or a glass of wine." I laughed faintly. "Both. Maybe." We started walking toward my car, the spring air cool against our skin. The sun had dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. Everything looked peaceful, but that calmness felt fragile like the eye of a storm. As we reached the car, Daisy paused. "You know he's not going to let this go, right?" I nodded. "I know, but I'm ready for whatever comes next." She smiled, but there was worry in her eyes. "You always say that." We drove back to my house on the edge of town, the windows down, the smell of lilacs drifting through the air. My home wasn't large, just a small white farmhouse that once belonged to my parents. The same one I'd renovated after moving back 2 years ago. It wasn't Willow Hill, but it was mine, and that mattered more. Daisy stayed for dinner, insisting she didn't want me to be alone. We cooked pasta, opened a bottle of cheap red wine, and talked about everything except the Bentons. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about that final look on Harold's face, the fury, the calculation, the quiet promise of revenge. When Daisy finally left, the sun had long set, and the town was wrapped in quiet. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and stood by the window, staring out at the dark field that stretched behind my house. Normally the night was peaceful here, the sound of crickets, the faint breeze through the trees. But that night, something felt off. I caught it out of the corner of my eye, first the faint glow of headlights at the edge of my driveway. The car was parked just far enough that I couldn't make out who was inside, but close enough that I knew they were watching. A chill ran through me. I didn't move at first. I just stood there, hidden behind the curtain, heart pounding in my chest. The engine idled quietly, steady and patient. After a few minutes, the headlights flickered off. The silhouette of the car lingered in the dark for a moment longer, and then it was gone. I waited another 10 minutes before I finally exhaled. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone had pulled over. But deep down, I knew better. Harold Benton was many things: a liar, a manipulator, a man of influence, but he was not the kind to accept humiliation. Especially not from someone he'd spent years looking down on. I locked every window in the house before heading upstairs. The lavender hat sat on my dresser, its brim catching the faint light from the hallway. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the small ridge where the folded deed rested inside. Somehow, it gave me comfort. "This is yours," I whispered, almost like a prayer to myself, to my family, to the ghosts of those who'd been wronged before me. The next morning, I woke to find an envelope slid under my front door. No postage, no name. Just my own written across the front in black ink. My stomach dropped. I knelt down and picked it up, feeling the weight of the paper, the faint scent of cologne familiar, expensive. I didn't have to open it to know who had sent it. But I did anyway. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed neatly, with one line written across the center in bold black letters. "You don't know what you've started." No signature, no address, just that warning. I stared at the words until they blurred before my eyes, my heart pounding in my ears. That night, I saw headlights parked outside my house, waiting too long to be a coincidence. The next morning, a letter slid under my front door. It lay there on the hardwood floor like something poisonous, sealed in an unmarked envelope. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the morning light spilling across the paper. The air in the house was still, almost heavy. I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen, slow and deliberate, each sound echoing louder than it should have. I knelt down, my fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. No return address, no name, just my own, written in neat block letters. The ink pressed deep into the paper as if whoever wrote it had done so with barely contained anger. I didn't need to guess who it was from. I opened it carefully, half expecting something worse than words. Inside was a single sheet of white paper with one line typed in bold black font. "You should rethink your actions before it's too late." That was all. No signature, no explanation, no threat spelled out, but the message was clear enough. I folded the letter back into the envelope, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The sun outside was bright, the kind of soft golden light that usually made mornings feel safe. But today it felt harsh, intrusive. The world was the same, but something in it had shifted. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the letter, debating whether to call the sheriff. But I already knew how that conversation would go. Sheriff Clay was one of Harold Benton's oldest friends. They'd hunted together, fished together, even gone into business on a few town projects. Calling him would do nothing but alert Harold that I was scared, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I called my lawyer, Mr. Jacobs. He was an older man from the next county over, sharp and methodical, someone who believed in paper trails more than people. He answered on the third ring. "Miss Mayfield, I was about to call you," he said. "Word travels fast in your town." "I figured," I said, forcing a breath. "I received a letter this morning. No signature, no return address, just a warning." There was a pause. "Do you believe it came from the mayor?" "I don't believe I know," I said quietly. "His handwriting might not be on it, but this reeks of him." "Keep it," he instructed. "Don't throw it away. Photograph everything. If this escalates, we'll need documentation." "I already have," I said. "And I'll make a copy." "Good. Stay cautious. Men like Harold don't take well to losing power." His words lingered after I hung up. I walked through the house, closing curtains, locking doors again even though I knew they were already locked. The silence was oppressive, every creak of the floorboards making me glance over my shoulder. Daisy came by later that afternoon after I texted her a picture of the letter. She took one look at it and shook her head. "He's trying to scare you," she said. "Classic Harold move, intimidate until you back down." I sighed. "I'm not backing down. But it's different now. This isn't just about pride, it's about safety." She frowned. "You should let someone know, even if it's not the sheriff, maybe one of your neighbors, just in case." "I will," I promised, though I didn't plan to. I wasn't ready to invite anyone else into this. People in town loved to help when there was gossip attached, but when it came to real courage, most disappeared into the background. That night, I double-checked all the locks before going to bed. The lavender hat still sat on my dresser, the deed tucked safely inside. I stared at it for a long moment, thinking about my parents, about everything they'd lost and how far I'd come to restore it. It wasn't just paper, it was legacy. But peace doesn't come easy when you've taken something back from powerful people. I barely slept. Every time the house creaked, I sat up, straining to listen. Once, near midnight, I thought I heard something outside, footsteps on the gravel driveway, soft but deliberate. I grabbed my phone, heart racing, and crept to the window. Nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The headlights from the previous night had burned an image in my mind that refused to fade. Morning came gray and cold. I decided to drive into town, hoping the normal routine would steady me. At the diner, people stared when I walked in. The whispers were louder now about the deed, the Easter scene, the mayor's fury. A few people offered polite nods, but others avoided eye contact. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee. The waitress, Trish, leaned close as she poured it. "You really shook things up, honey," she said. "I've never seen the Bentons so red-faced." "I didn't mean to start a war," I said. She snorted. "Oh, you did. You just don't know how deep it runs yet." Her words unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. When I got home later that afternoon, the mailbox flag was down. I hadn't sent anything out, so I frowned, stepping closer. Inside were two envelopes, one addressed to me, another with no markings at all. The first was from Mr. Jacobs, confirming that he'd filed additional paperwork to secure my ownership. The second, though, it was identical to the first anonymous letter. Same paper. Same ink. Same lack of return address. This time it said only, "Stop digging before you uncover something you'll wish you hadn't." I stared at it, feeling a slow chill crawl up my spine. This wasn't just intimidation, it was a warning. A promise that there were deeper secrets buried beneath this land. Secrets the Bentons would do anything to protect. I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking as I set the letter beside the first one on the kitchen table. They sat there like twin ghosts, silent reminders that the fight wasn't over. Night fell quickly. I tried to distract myself with the television, but my thoughts kept circling back to the Bentons, the look on Harold's face, the silence of Barbara, the way power slipped through their fingers like water. And then, just as I was starting to doze off on the couch, I heard it glass breaking. The sound came from outside, sharp and sudden. My body reacted before my mind did. I grabbed my phone and ran to the window. The porch light had gone out. The bulb lay shattered on the wooden steps below. Someone had thrown a rock. I stepped back from the window, heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Shadows shifted at the edge of the yard, but I couldn't tell if it was the wind or a person watching. With shaking hands, I called the sheriff's office, forcing my voice steady as I reported the vandalism. The dispatcher promised to send someone, but I knew what that meant. Clay would show up, say a few empty words, and nothing would come of it. Still, I waited. When the knock finally came 20 minutes later, Sheriff Clay stood on my porch, flashlight in hand and that familiar tight smile on his face. "Evening, Katrina," he said. "Heard you had some trouble." I nodded, motioning toward the broken light. "Someone threw a rock. I think I'm being watched." He shined the beam around lazily, then shrugged. "Probably kids. You know how they get." "I don't think so," I said sharply. "This isn't random." He looked at me for a moment, then sighed. "I'll make a note of it, all right? But there's not much we can do unless you catch them in the act." I bit back the urge to argue. "Just document it," I said finally. He nodded, tipped his hat, and left. His car disappeared down the road, leaving me alone again with the dark and the quiet hum of fear pressing against my chest. I stood there at the window long after he was gone, staring into the night. And when I heard glass break outside that night, my heart nearly stopped. I grabbed my phone and ran to the window. The porch light was out, the bulb shattered in jagged pieces across the steps. The beam from my phone barely reached the end of the driveway, where the gravel disappeared into shadow. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct screamed that someone was still out there. The air outside was still unnaturally still. Even the crickets had gone quiet. I pressed my hand against the glass, trying to see past my own reflection, but the night gave me nothing. Just darkness, just silence, then a faint crunch of footstep, somewhere near the hedge line. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. No answer. I swallowed hard, backing away from the window and dialing the sheriff again, even though I knew it wouldn't help. He'd already dismissed the broken light as a prank, and the idea of hearing that same calm, patronizing tone again made my stomach twist. Still, I had to report it. The dispatcher answered, and I explained what I'd heard. She promised to send a car by. That phrase, "send a car by," was beginning to feel like code for do nothing at all. When I hung up, I realized my hands were shaking. The deed was still tucked safely inside the lavender hat upstairs. But suddenly, I felt exposed, like the paper itself was a target. Like whoever was watching me knew exactly what I was protecting. I turned on every light in the house, locked every door again, and sat in the living room, gripping my phone. The clock ticked slowly, mocking me with every passing second. Daisy called just after midnight. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I had this awful feeling something happened." I hesitated before telling her. "Someone was outside again," I said quietly. "They broke the porch light this time." She cursed under her breath. "Katrina, you need to leave that house. Come stay with me for a few nights." "I can't," I said. "If I run, that's exactly what he wants. This is my home." She sighed. "Then at least let me come over." I thought about it. Daisy lived 15 minutes away, and it was already late. "No," I said finally. "Just stay on the phone with me for a bit." We talked for an hour about the Bentons, about the town, about how quickly everything had spiraled. I told her about the letters, about the sheriff's half-hearted visit. about how I felt the mayor wasn't just angry, he was planning something. "You should file a restraining order," she said. "Even if it's symbolic, get his behavior on record." "I will," I promised, though I wasn't sure how much that would help when the system itself seemed to bend in his favor. By the time I hung up, it was nearly 2 a.m. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. I went upstairs and checked the window in every room, double-checking locks until my fingers hurt. When I finally crawled into bed, I left the lamp on beside me. Sleep came in pieces, fitful and shallow. Every noise jolted me awake. Around 3:30, I heard the low hum of a car engine outside. I froze. It idled for a few seconds, then drove off slowly. I didn't even get up to look this time. I just stared at the ceiling, clutching the blanket, feeling utterly trapped in my own home. Morning sunlight eventually crept through the blinds, and with it came a strange calm. The fear from the night before faded into something colder: determination. If Harold Benton wanted to intimidate me, he'd have to try harder. I brewed coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and started writing everything down: times, dates, every sound, every strange car. I made copies of the letters and stored them in a sealed envelope in my desk drawer. I wasn't going to be caught unprepared again. That afternoon, I drove to the county office to file a formal harassment report. The clerk, a young woman named Lena, looked uneasy when I explained what was happening. "You're talking about the Bentons?" she whispered. "Yes," I said flatly. "I am." Her eyes darted to the door, as if afraid someone might hear. "Be careful, Miss Mayfield. People who cross them, well, things get complicated." "I'm not scared of complicated," I said, sliding the documents across the counter. When I got home, I found Daisy waiting on my porch. She looked relieved when she saw me pull in. "I thought you'd been followed," she said. "Maybe I was," I admitted, but not for long. We spent the afternoon together, cleaning up the broken glass and talking about next steps. She offered again to let me stay with her, but I still refused. This house wasn't just walls and wood, it was my proof that the Mayfields didn't bow to anyone. That night, Daisy insisted on staying over just in case. We made tea, sat on the couch, and watched the fire flicker in the hearth. For a brief while, it almost felt normal again. But peace is fragile. Around 10, there was a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. Daisy jumped, setting down her cup. Who would be here this late? I hesitated. Probably no one we want to see. I peered through the peephole. It was Sheriff Clay again. His expression was unreadable. His hat tilted low. I opened the door a few inches. "What is it, Sheriff?" He shifted awkwardly. "Just checking in," he said. "Wanted to see if everything's all right after last night." I folded my arms. "Did you find out who threw the rock?" He shook his head. "Afraid not, but like I said, probably just kids. Kids who know exactly where I live and when to show up," I said. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You think Harold's behind this?" I met his gaze evenly. "I don't think I know," he sighed. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Katrina. Maybe it's best to lay low for a while." I stiffened. "Lay low? I've done nothing wrong." "I didn't say you did," he said quickly. "Just sayin' Harold's a proud man. You took away his crown jewel. Men like that don't take humiliation well." He tipped his hat and turned to leave. "Be careful, Miss Mayfield." The words sounded like a warning and a dismissal at the same time. When the door closed, Daisy turned to me, her face pale. "You can't trust him," she whispered. "I don't," I said, "but I trust myself." The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Daisy eventually fell asleep on the couch, but I stayed awake, sitting by the window with a cup of cold tea, watching the dark stretch across the fields. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just before dawn, my phone buzzed a message from an unknown number. I opened it, my breath catching as I read the words. "You should have stayed quiet. The next letter won't be a warning." My hands shook as I set the phone down. I didn't know whether to call the police again or call my stated and dem, lawyer or both. But I knew one thing for certain. The Bentons weren't done. Then, 2 days later, I received a summons. Barbara and her husband were suing me. They accused me of fraud and property theft. When the summons arrived, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time just staring at the envelope. My name was printed neatly in black, the county court seal stamped in red across the top corner. It looked so official, so cold, so deliberate. It was exactly the kind of move I'd expected from Harold Benton, a way to drag me back into the dirt, to make me relive every ounce of shame my family had once endured. Inside, the language was dense and legalistic, but the accusation was simple enough. I had illegally acquired and falsified property records in an attempt to extort ownership of Willow Hill Estate. It was laughable, except it wasn't. They were trying to turn my truth into a crime. I called my lawyer, Mr. Jacobs, immediately. He listened quietly as I read the notice over the phone, then sighed. "I expected this," he said. "They're going to try to bury you in paperwork, force you into court, and hope you'll give up." "I won't," I said, though my voice trembled. "I know," he replied. "But we need to prepare for a long fight." The following weeks became a blur of legal documents, affidavits, and tense phone calls. Every morning I'd drive to his office 2 counties over, sit under the fluorescent lights, and go over every piece of evidence, every letter, every copy, every stamp. The Bentons' lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to delay, confuse, and intimidate. Through it all, I refused to back down. Daisy was my anchor. She showed up at my door almost every night with coffee or takeout, refusing to let me face it alone. "They're desperate," she kept saying. "You scared them, that's why they're lashing out." Maybe she was right. But even knowing that didn't make the days easier. The town was divided. Half the people now treated me with cautious respect, whispering "good for her" when I walked by. The other half crossed the street to avoid me. Some still believed the Bentons' version that I was a schemer, trying to take what wasn't mine. Rumors spread fast in small towns, they always do. By the time the first court hearing came, I was exhausted. The courthouse smelled of old wood and coffee. The benches creaked as people settled in, some there for gossip, others out of morbid curiosity. I saw familiar faces, neighbors, church members, even the pastor. But it was Harold and Barbara who caught my attention. They walked in like royalty returning from exile. Barbara's chin tilted high, Harold in a dark tailored suit that probably cost more than my car. He didn't look at me once, but I felt his presence like a storm brewing behind me. When the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that the truth was on my side. Mr. Jacobs began by presenting the county documents, the notarized deed, and the original letters confirming the reinstatement of my family's ownership. His voice was calm, firm, unwavering. The Bentons' lawyer, a slick man with a polished grin, countered with rehearsed outrage. He claimed I'd tampered with archived records, fabricated old letters, and coerced signatures. He waved his hands dramatically as he spoke, but every argument crumbled the moment Jacobs showed the court the official seals and signatures that matched perfectly with county records. Halfway through the hearing, I caught Harold's eyes across the room. His mask of calm was slipping again. His fingers twitched on the table, and I could tell he hated every second of being publicly questioned. Barbara, on the other hand, looked like she'd rehearsed her performance. She dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, pretending to cry when her lawyer described their emotional distress. It might have worked if the judge hadn't been watching her roll her eyes 2 seconds earlier. When my turn came to testify, I stood and walked to the front, clutching the folder of evidence. My hands were cold, but my voice stayed steady. I told them everything about the discovery of my father's letters, the missing files, the legal verification, the harassment that followed. I didn't dramatize it. I just told the truth. When I finished, there was silence. The judge nodded slowly, then turned his gaze toward the Bentons' table. "Do you have any factual evidence that contradicts Miss Mayfield's claim?" he asked. Their lawyer fumbled, glancing at Harold, who was staring straight ahead, his jaw locked. We have concerns about the validity of the documents," he stammered. "Concerns aren't evidence," the judge said coolly. "Unless you can prove forgery or falsification, this court recognizes the county's ruling as valid." Barbara made a strangled sound, like a suppressed gasp. Harold's face flushed crimson. The judge continued, his tone final. The claim against Miss Mayfield is dismissed with prejudice. The property deed stands. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words echoed in my mind, dismissed with prejudice. It was over. I felt Daisy's hand slip into mine from the gallery, squeezing tight. Across the aisle, Barbara's composure crumbled. Her tears were real this time, angry, humiliated tears that streaked her makeup. Harold sat stone still, staring at the floor. The judge stood, gavelled once, and left the room. The sound of the gavel was like thunder, final and absolute. I turned to Mr. Jacobs, my voice barely above a whisper. We won? He smiled, a rare, genuine smile. We did. Outside the courthouse, the sky was a brilliant blue. People lingered on the steps, whispering, pointing, watching me like they were seeing me for the first time. I ignored them all. For the first time in years, I felt light, untethered from the weight of old shame. Daisy hugged me tight. You did it, she said into my shoulder. It's finally over. But as I looked across the street, I saw Harold and Barbara getting into their car. He caught my gaze, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, two people bound by truth and ruin. His eyes were empty now, cold. But beneath that calm, I could still see the embers of fury. He wasn't used to losing, and I knew men like Harold Benton didn't lose quietly. And when the verdict was read, Barbara's mask of arrogance finally shattered. I walked out of that courtroom with tears of triumph in my eyes. The afternoon sun was blinding, and for a moment, I just stood there on the courthouse steps, blinking against the light. The world felt strangely quiet, as if even the wind was pausing to give me this moment. The tension that had lived in my body for months, years, really finally began to melt away. I took a deep breath, the kind of breath that fills your lungs with something more than air. It was freedom. Daisy was beside me, grinning from ear to ear, her eyes glassy with emotion. You did it, she said again. As if saying it enough times might make it real. It's over. I smiled, though my voice trembled. It's really over. We walked down the courthouse steps hand in hand. Reporters waited at the bottom, local news crews, bloggers, and even a few curious townsfolk who'd never cared about the Mayfields until now. They crowded around, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Miss Mayfield, how does it feel to reclaim your family's legacy? Do you have any comment for the Bentons? What will you do with Willow Hill now? Their questions buzzed like bees, fast and relentless. I wasn't used to attention, especially not this kind. I gave simple answers, honest ones. It feels right, I said. It feels like justice. And that was all I needed to say. Daisy looped her arm through mine, steering me toward her car. Ignore them, she whispered. They'll find something else to gossip about by next week. We laughed as we drove away, and for the first time in a long time, that laugh wasn't forced. The weight I'd been carrying since my teenage years had finally lifted. I didn't have to fight anymore. I didn't have to prove myself. We stopped by a small cafe on the edge of town, one that overlooked the fields rolling out toward Willow Hill. The estate shimmered faintly in the distance, the roofline of the old farmhouse just visible above the trees. After everything, it's yours again. I watched the sunlight glint off the distant windows, and my heart swelled. It's not just mine, I said softly. It's my family's. It's every Mayfield that came before me. We clinked our coffee cups together in a quiet toast. Over the next few weeks, life began to settle back into something resembling normal. The Bentons disappeared from public view. Rumor had it they were selling their remaining properties and planning to move away. The mayor's resignation letter appeared in the local paper one morning, hidden between the classifieds and the community calendar. No farewell party, no ceremony, just a few lines and his name in black and white. The town changed after that. People began treating me differently, not out of pity or fear, but with something new. Respect. Genuine respect. I was invited to community events again. The same women who once laughed at my ridiculous hat now complimented it, calling it iconic. It was strange, almost surreal, to watch their opinions shift with the wind. But I didn't hold grudges. I'd seen enough bitterness in this town to last a lifetime. Instead, I focused on rebuilding Willow Hill. The estate was in rough shape, years of neglect had left it worn and hollow. But every broken window, every cracked tile felt like an opportunity to heal, something deeper. I hired local workers, including some families who'd once struggled under the Benton's thumb. Together, we cleared out debris, restored the gardens, repainted the shutters, and replaced the old fence posts. It became more than just a renovation, it was a renewal. I decided early on that I wouldn't keep the entire property private. My grandfather had always dreamed of turning part of the land into a place for the community, a space where people could gather, grow food, and reconnect. So I did exactly that. We started a community garden. The first day, only a handful of people showed up, nervous, hesitant, unsure if they were really welcome. But once the shovels hit the soil, something magical happened. Conversations flowed easily, laughter filled the air, and the smell of freshly turned earth mixed with spring blossoms. It felt like the town was finally breathing again. Daisy was there every weekend, helping plant rows of tomatoes and herbs. Even Mrs. Langley, who was nearing 80, insisted on bringing homemade lemonade for everyone. I'd often catch myself standing at the edge of the garden, watching families work side by side, children digging little holes for seedlings, mothers chatting over wheelbarrows, fathers fixing old tools. It was exactly what my grandfather had wanted. People began to talk about the Mayfields differently. No longer as a tragedy, but as a story of redemption. The name that once carried shame, now carried strength. Still, sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of something darker on the horizon, an unease that hadn't quite faded. I'd see unfamiliar cars parked a little too long near the gate, or notice strangers driving by slowly, their eyes lingering on the house. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just paranoia left over from the months of fear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, Harold Benton was still out there, nursing his humiliation like an old wound. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Daisy and I sat on the porch overlooking the garden. Fireflies danced over the fields, and the scent of lavender drifted from the flower beds. "You've changed this town, you know," Daisy said quietly. I smiled. Maybe the town just needed a reminder of what's right. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "Your parents would be so proud." My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I looked toward the horizon, where the last light faded behind the old willow trees, and whispered, "I hope so." After she left that night, I walked upstairs and placed the deed, now framed and protected, beside my grandmother's hat on the mantel. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was proof that perseverance, no matter how long buried, could bloom again. As I stood there, surrounded by quiet, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Then, the next morning, the mail came. Among the usual flyers and bills was a small cream-colored envelope with no return address. My stomach sank the moment I saw it. The handwriting was delicate, looping, and unmistakably familiar. I tore it open. Inside was a short letter, handwritten in blue ink. The words were calm, almost elegant. "You may have won the land, but you'll never own the respect that came with it. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." It was signed, simply, Barbara Benton. I stood there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands, the peace I'd felt moments earlier evaporating like mist. But one final letter arrived, postmarked from Barbara herself. Inside the envelope was a note and a small photo. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I unfolded it. I hadn't seen Barbara's handwriting since high school bake sales and charity drives, always perfect, deliberate, the kind of script that announced itself as belonging to someone important. Even now, that same proud precision bled through the ink. The letter was short, almost cruel in its simplicity. "You may have the land, but you'll never have our respect." There was no greeting, no signature flourish, just that one sentence written in cold blue ink. I could practically hear her voice saying it, tight, bitter, full of the venom she used to coat her gossip in. Attached to the bottom of the letter was a small black and white photograph. It was old, maybe from 20 or 30 years ago, slightly faded at the edges. It showed Barbara and Harold standing in front of Willow Hill Estate, smiling, arms around each other, their young son perched on Harold's shoulders. Behind them, the fields stretched wide and green, a picture of everything I'd spent my life fighting to reclaim. For a moment, I just stared at it. The image felt like a ghost reaching out from the past, whispering that no matter what papers said, some people would never let go. It wasn't about the property anymore. It was about power, perception. Barbara didn't care that I'd won. She cared that people knew she'd lost. I sat down at the kitchen table, the photo still in my hand. My coffee went cold beside me as I turned the letter over and over, searching for some hidden meaning that wasn't there. It wasn't a threat this time. It was worse, it was a reminder. A reminder that some grudges don't fade, they calcify. That evening, Daisy came by, her hair pulled up, dirt on her jeans from the community garden. "You got mail," she said, spotting the letter on the table. "From who?" "Barbara." Her eyebrows shot up. "You're kidding." I slid the letter toward her. She read it silently, then frowned. "That woman just doesn't quit." "It's not the words that bother me," I said softly. "It's the picture." Daisy picked it up, studying the smiling couple frozen in time. "They look happy." "They were," I said. "Happy on stolen land." She set it down gently. "So what are you going to do?" I looked out the window. The sun was setting over the fields, painting the sky in orange and pink. "Nothing," I said finally. "She's already lost more than I ever could have taken." Daisy leaned back in her chair, watching me quietly. "You really mean that?" I nodded. "I don't need their respect. I have peace, and that's worth more." For a while, neither of us spoke. The house creaked as it always did in the evening, the sound of settling wood and time. Somewhere outside, a hawk cried. The world was still turning, moving forward. Even if Barbara Benton couldn't. After Daisy left that night, I stood by the fireplace, the letter and photo still on the table behind me. The flames crackled softly, warm and steady. I picked up the photo again, studied Barbara's confident smile one last time, and then slipped it into the fire. The edges curled instantly, the heat swallowing the image until only ash remained. Then I fed the letter in after it, watching the blue ink turn black and vanish into smoke. It felt right cleansing. Not revenge, not defiance, just release. When it was done, I opened the window slightly, letting the ashes drift out into the cool night air. The breeze carried them upward, scattering them into the darkness. Somewhere out there, they would fall onto the fields of Willow Hill, becoming part of the soil. I smiled at the thought. Even their bitterness would return to my land in the end. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch, staring out at the moonlit fields. The garden glowed faintly under the silver light, rows of sprouting green, shimmering like hope reborn. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full, alive with the small sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about what came next. Not court cases or threats or ghosts of the past, but the future. Maybe I'd start a small event every spring, a community picnic at Willow Hill. A day of laughter, food, and music. A way to remind everyone that this place, once soaked in greed and pride, had become something good again. Something pure. The thought made me smile. I reached for my phone and sent a quick text to Daisy. "Thinking of having a picnic here next Easter. Bring everyone. We'll make it a new tradition," she replied a minute later. "You in that hat again?" I laughed aloud, shaking my head. Of course. The same hat that had once been a symbol of ridicule was now my quiet crown. I would never forget that day when they laughed, when whispers filled the churchyard, when Barbara sneered and called me ridiculous. And I would never forget the moment those laughs turned into silence when the truth glimmered beneath the sunlight. That hat, and the deed hidden inside it, had carried generations of pain and justice on its brim. It wasn't just fabric and lace, it was legacy. I went back inside, set the empty glass in the sink, and looked around my home, the walls I'd repainted, the curtains I'd sewn myself, the framed deed on the mantel beside my grandmother's lavender hat. The house smelled faintly of smoke and lavender, warm and familiar. In that moment, I realized something simple yet profound. Victory wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. True revenge wasn't about destroying others, it was about reclaiming yourself, your voice, your dignity. Barbara's letter had been meant to wound me. But instead, it reminded me how far I'd come. How untouchable peace could feel when you'd fought for it and earned it. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside again. The air was cool, crisp, and full of spring. I could hear frogs calling near the creek, the soft hum of life continuing exactly as it should. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. And as I watched the sunrise, I realized I had finally reclaimed more than land. I had reclaimed myself. Looking back, that Easter hat was never just an accessory. When I first put it on that morning, I thought I was wearing a symbol of defiance, a way to make a statement to people who had written me off long ago. But as time passed, I came to see it for what it really was, a bridge. It connected me to every woman in my family who had endured loss, silence, and small-town cruelty with quiet grace. That lavender brim carried our entire history stitched into its lace. Now, when I stand in front of the mirror and see it perched on the shelf above my desk, it feels less like a trophy and more like a reminder that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through generations, waiting for the right moment to be heard. A year has passed since that Easter Sunday. The town is different now, so am I. The Bentons moved away quietly a few months after losing the lawsuit. Rumor has it they sold everything and left for the coast. No one's heard from them since, though their name still comes up in whispers now and then. The old power they once held here dissolved the day truth stood in sunlight. Willow Hill has changed too. The once empty estate now hums with life again. The gardens bloom wider every season, the fences freshly painted, the farmhouse alive with laughter instead of bitterness. Every weekend, families come to tend the community garden, bringing their children, their pets, their hopes. The land feels alive again, like it's breathing after decades of holding its breath. Sometimes I walk those fields barefoot, feeling the cool soil beneath my feet. I swear I can almost hear my parents in the wind, their voices carried through the rustling willow branches. I imagine my grandfather smiling, leaning against the fence post, proud that his work and his name endured after all. Every Easter, I host the community picnic I promised Daisy. The first year, only a few families came, unsure of what to expect. But this year, the lawn was filled, tables spread with homemade food, children chasing one another, the pastor saying a short prayer before the meal. The laughter that filled the air sounded different than the laughter I'd heard that day at church. It wasn't sharp or cruel. It was soft, genuine, full of warmth. I wore the hat again, of course. The same lavender satin, the same lace trim, now lovingly restored. Some of the older women recognized it immediately. "That's the hat, isn't it?" One whispered with a grin. I only smiled and said, "It's the same one." People asked me to tell the story again the Easter when the town laughed and everything changed. I told it not with pride or spite, but with calm. The story had become more than just mine. It was a piece of our town's history now, a lesson about truth, resilience, and the quiet kind of revenge that doesn't destroy but rebuilds. After everyone left that evening, Daisy and I sat on the porch steps, watching the last rays of sun melt into the horizon. She nudged me and said, "Do you ever miss it? The fight?" I shook my head. "No," I said softly. "The fight was never the goal. The peace after it was." She smiled, resting her head on my shoulder. "You really turned everything around, Kat. I think you taught them all what real power looks like." I didn't answer right away. I was watching the children running through the fading light, their laughter echoing across the fields. That sound, the innocent joy of people unburdened by pride, was worth more than any revenge could ever bring. Later that night, after Daisy left, I went inside and lit the fireplace. I took down the framed deed from the mantel, dusted it gently, and placed it beside my grandmother's hat. They belonged together, proof of loss and reclamation, symbols of two kinds of inheritance, the one written on paper and the one written in spirit. I poured myself a cup of tea and stood by the window, gazing out over the moonlit land. The fields shimmered silver under the light, stretching far beyond what my eyes could see. This was mine not just in name but in truth. And more than that, it was home. I thought about Barbara's letter then, about the words she'd written. You may have the land, but you'll never have our respect. I smiled. She'd been right in one way. I didn't need her respect. Respect built on arrogance and pretense had no value. What I had was far greater peace, community, dignity, things she'd never understand. I set the teacup down and stepped outside once more. The air was cool, carrying the scent of lilacs and soil. Fireflies blinked along the fence line like tiny stars. I walked to the edge of the field, where the willows swayed in the gentle breeze. The night was still, calm, and alive with memory. For a long moment, I stood there with my eyes closed, feeling the wind brush through my hair, listening to the faint hum of life around me. I thought of everything, the humiliation, the fear, the letters, the courtroom, the victory. Every scar I'd earned had turned into something beautiful. Some stories end with a roar. Mine ended in silence, a soft, steady silence that said everything words never could. Justice doesn't always roar, sometimes it wears a lavender hat. I turned back toward the house, its windows glowing warmly in the dark, laughter from the last guests still faint in the distance. My heart felt full, grounded, complete. And that's how a day of laughter turned into the day I took back everything that was rightfully mine.